The stars stretched endlessly across the dark sea of space, while the hum of the engines filled the small ship that drifted along the outer rim of known systems. Daniel sat in the cockpit, his tired eyes watching the scanners as the faint signal of a distress beacon blinked weakly on his screen. Most travelers ignored such faint signals because they were often debris or old wrecks with nothing but silence left behind. But Daniel was not the type of man to pass something without checking. He adjusted his course, and the ship turned toward the abandoned beacon. Hours later he arrived at the source and saw the remains of a crashed vessel spread across a barren moon. The surface was gray and cracked, lifeless under the cold light of distant suns. Smoke no longer rose from the wreck, but the twisted metal looked recent, as if it had not been here long. Daniel landed his ship and stepped out into the thin air with his breathing mask secure, his boots crunching on the dust. He expected nothing more than broken panels and maybe a few scattered supplies. But as he moved among the ruins, a faint sound reached him. At first he thought it was the wind through the fractured hull, but when he listened closely, he realized it was a cry, soft and weak, almost like the whimper of a child. He moved quickly, following the sound until he found a small chamber that had been partly shielded from the crash. Inside he saw a small creature huddled against a piece of shattered wall. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, its body thin as if hunger had already taken hold. Two bright golden eyes looked up at him in fear and pain. It was not human, yet Daniel felt the weight of its gaze pierce through him like any child begging for help. The cub was no bigger than a human toddler, though its features marked it as alien. Its ears were pointed and tall, its tail coiled tightly around its body, and small ridges ran along its forehead where bone had formed protective lines. Still, none of those details mattered to Daniel in that moment. All he saw was a living creature abandoned in death and ruin. He crouched slowly, speaking in a calm voice, though he knew it could not understand his words. He reached out a hand, offering no harm. The cub hissed faintly but lacked the strength to move. Daniel noticed the remains of a ration pack near its side, torn open, perhaps used by someone who had tried to keep it alive before the end. Yet, now there was nothing left for it to eat. Without thinking, he pulled a pack from his own belt, tore it open, and set it gently beside the cub. The smell caught its attention, and the small creature sniffed cautiously, then weakly began to eat. Daniel felt a strange warmth fill him as he watched it fight for life with what little strength remained. The scanner on his wrist beeped with a warning that oxygen levels outside the mask were dropping, but Daniel ignored it for a few moments. Longer. He knew he could not leave the cub here. The wreck was silent, no survivors, no family, no one searching. Whoever had been here was gone, and this small life was left to fade. He wrapped his jacket around the cub, careful not to frighten it, and lifted it gently into his arms. It was lighter than he expected, bones pressing against skin beneath the fur. The eyes closed from exhaustion, but the small chest rose and fell as breath returned. When he carried it back to his ship, the crew questioned him. They warned him that bringing an unknown creature aboard was dangerous. Some said it could carry disease. Others muttered that he was foolish to care for an alien when resources were scarce, even for their own kind. But Daniel did not listen. He placed the cub in the medical pod, cleaned its wounds, and gave it water. Slowly the little one began to regain some strength. Over the following days he kept watch, feeding it with careful portions, speaking softly though it did not know his language. Each day its eyes grew brighter, following him as he moved around the cabin. Sometimes it would make a soft sound, almost like a purr, when he sat near. Daniel found himself smiling, though he did not often smile in the lonely paths of space. He began calling it Lyra, not because the name had meaning, but because he felt it needed something more than creature or cub. As time passed, Daniel wondered about its origin. He searched records, but could not find details about the wreck or the species. Rumors spread through the stations they visited that a lost child of a powerful race had vanished in war. But no proof connected those whispers to the small life he carried with him. For Daniel, it did not matter. What mattered was that the cub lived. At night, when the stars drifted past the windows and silence settled over the ship, Daniel often thought about what might come. He knew he was only one man with limited means. Raising a creature not of his kind would bring challenges he could not imagine. Yet every time he considered leaving it with a station or turning it over to officials, he remembered the way its golden eyes had looked at him in that broken wreck, the silent plea for life. He could not walk away from that. The journey stretched on, and the bond between man and cub began to grow. What had started as a rescue became something more, something Daniel could not quite name. The crew still whispered their doubts, but they no longer questioned him openly. They saw how the cub clung to him, how its strength returned, how its presence seemed to lift even the weariness of long voyages. Still, a shadow lingered. Daniel knew that one day others might come searching, and if they learned of Lyra, they might not see her as a life worth saving, but as a threat to control. For now, though the little one slept safely in the warmth of his ship, and Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of peace. In the vast emptiness of space, he'd found a fragile spark of life, and by choosing to protect it, he felt for the first time in many years that he was not entirely alone. The bond of the days turned into weeks, and the little cub slowly grew stronger under Daniel's care. What had once been a fragile body clinging to life became a lively creature with quick movements and curious eyes. She no longer trembled when she walked across the metal floor of the ship, but moved with a cautious confidence, her tail flicking with every step. Daniel often found her exploring the corners of the cabin, tugging at wires, or pressing her nose against the cold glass of the viewing panels where stars drifted by in endless rivers of light. Daniel called her Lyra, and though she did not understand the meaning of the name, she responded to it with a soft chirp or tilt of her head. He would speak to her while he worked, telling her stories of planets he had visited, of storms he had survived, of the quiet dangers that filled the vast unknown. Sometimes she would sit near him with her head tilted, golden eyes fixed as if she was listening with a deeper understanding than any child should have. He could not explain it, but he felt she was learning far more quickly than he expected. One evening, as he repaired a damaged panel in the engine room, he noticed Lyra mimicking his actions. She picked up a small tool, held it clumsily in her paws, and tapped it against the floor, as if copying his movements. He laughed at the sight, but then realized she was watching carefully, studying every detail of what he did. Within weeks, she learned how to press the right buttons to open doors, how to bring him objects he needed, even how to find her own food packs when he was busy. Her intelligence was growing at a pace that unsettled the crew. Some of them began to whisper more openly now. They said no ordinary creature could adapt so quickly, that perhaps she belonged to a species far more advanced and dangerous. Daniel dismissed their fears in public, but in private he also wondered what future awaited her. The thought of handing her to authorities crossed his mind again, but each time he looked at her face, still soft and childlike despite her growth, he could not do it. He had saved her once, and to him that meant he had accepted the duty to protect her no matter the risk. As months passed, the bond between them deepened. She began to follow him everywhere, padding softly through the halls, curling near his chair when he worked in the cockpit, resting her head against his arm when fatigue overtook him. The simple presence of her warmth gave him comfort in the cold silence of the endless void. For the first time in years, he felt he had a reason beyond survival to keep moving forward. But with the bond came new dangers. On a trading station at the edge of a mining system, word spread quickly about the strange creature traveling with humans. Merchants eyed her with suspicion. Bounty hunters whispered about prices offered by unknown clients, And Daniel soon found himself being watched more closely than he liked. One night, as he carried supplies back to the ship, a group of strangers cornered him in the shadows of a docking bay. They demanded he hand over the creature, claiming it belonged to them. Daniel's hand instinctively moved to the weapon at his side, but before a fight could erupt, Lyra appeared from behind him with a low growl that carried more power than her small frame should allow. The men hesitated, their courage faltering, as those golden eyes glowed with something sharp and dangerous. In that moment, Daniel realized she was not only intelligent, but also fiercely protective of him, just as he was of her. The strangers backed away, and Daniel hurried them both back to the ship, but the warning was clear. Their journey would not remain unnoticed forever. The more time passed, the more Lyra revealed abilities that amazed and unsettled Daniel. She seemed to sense the moods of those around her. When crew members argued, she placed herself between them and made soft sounds, until tempers cooled. When Daniel felt troubled, she would press her head against his hand until the heaviness in his chest eased. She learned human gestures quickly, pointing when she wanted something, shaking her head when refusing food, nodding when she understood. Slowly she even began to form broken words in his language, rough and imperfect, but carrying meaning. The first time she called him Dal, close enough to his name, he felt tears sting his eyes, though he had not cried in years. By the end of the first year, Lyra had grown taller, her body strong, her movements graceful. The ridges on her forehead had sharpened, giving her a regal appearance even in youth. She wore simple garments Daniel made from cloth, but on her they looked like the robes of someone destined for more. She no longer seemed like a helpless cub, but a being with the presence of a leader in the making. Daniel knew, he could not deny it, she was not ordinary. She was extraordinary, and the universe would one day notice. The crew remained divided. Some had grown fond of her, even playing games with her during long journeys, while others kept their distance, afraid of what she might become. Rumors reached them of wars stirring in distant systems, of powerful empires seeking to reclaim lost heirs, and each whisper made Daniel tighten his guard around her. He did not know her true origin, but he feared that one day someone would come demanding her return, and when that happened, he would not be able to stop it. Yet for now, life aboard the ship continued. Lyra and Daniel shared meals together, studied maps of stars, and watched as galaxies spun slowly outside their windows. Sometimes she asked him, in her broken words, about family, about home. Daniel never had a good answer. He simply told her that home was where they were together, and she seemed content with that for the time being. Late at night, when the engines purred softly and the rest of the crew slept, Daniel often sat in silence, watching her sleep. He wondered what destiny awaited her, what role she would play in the great unfolding of the universe. She was no longer the helpless cub he had found in the ruins of a battlefield, but something greater, something that seemed to grow beyond his reach each day. A small part of him feared the day she would no longer need him, yet another part felt pride at seeing her strength and spirit. The bond between man and alien cub had become unbreakable, woven from survival, trust, and a kind of love neither of them could have expected. Still, in the distance, danger stirred, and though Daniel could not yet see it, the path ahead would soon force them to face the truth of who she really was. The separation. The years moved quietly for Daniel and Lyra, as they traveled from one system to another, always staying on the edge of crowded space, always careful not to attract too much attention. Lyra grew into her strength, and where once she was a fragile cub, now she was a young being with sharp eyes and steady movements. She trained her body naturally, climbing the narrow halls of the ship, practicing with tools, lifting crates with ease, and even learning to read human text with surprising speed. Daniel often watched her with silent pride, though deep in his heart, He carried a shadow of fear that her path would not remain in his hands forever. It was during one journey through the outer belts that signs of trouble began. A patrol ship hailed them, marked with symbols Daniel did not recognize. The voice that came through the com was sharp and commanding, demanding inspection. Daniel tried to mask his unease, but he knew the questions would come. When the patrol boarded, their eyes quickly fell on Lyra. She stood behind Daniel, calm yet watchful, her golden eyes meeting theirs with quiet strength. The officers whispered among themselves, exchanging words in a language Daniel could not understand, but the tone was clear enough. Recognition had struck them. They left without open conflict, but Daniel knew the danger was real now. Whoever those officers were, they had seen her, and news would spread. Lyra sensed his worry and asked in her broken speech why the men looked at her so strangely. Daniel told her only that some people might want to take her away, but she shook her head and clung to his arm, saying simply, "Dal home." The words cut through him, for he knew that one day she would learn the truth of her origins, and home might no longer be the small ship they shared. Not long after it happened, a great vessel arrived in orbit above a trade station they were visiting, a ship unlike any Daniel had ever seen, vast and gleaming with banners that carried an unfamiliar crest. From it descended soldiers in silver armor, their steps heavy with authority, their eyes scanning every corner until they found what they sought. They moved with certainty, and Daniel realized with dread that they had come for Lyra. The soldiers spoke words that she seemed to understand, though Daniel did not. Her eyes widened as their leader knelt before her, speaking softly as if addressing someone of great importance. Daniel demanded to know what they wanted, his voice shaking with anger, but they ignored him. Instead, the leader finally turned and said in broken human tongue, "She belongs with us. She is heir." The truth crashed upon Daniel like a wave. All the whispers, all the rumors, all the strange abilities that Lyra had shown it, all made sense now. She was not just a lost child, but part of something far larger, perhaps a royal line, perhaps the future of an empire. He felt his stomach twist as he looked at her, still so young in his eyes, yet claimed by others as theirs. Lyra looked back at him with confusion and fear. She clung to his hand, refusing to let go, but the soldiers stood waiting. Daniel's crew urged him not to go. Resist. They warned him that to defy such power would bring death to all of them. He wanted to fight, to protect her as he had from the beginning, but deep inside he knew they were right. If he resisted, both he and Lyra would be destroyed. He knelt down to her level, his voice low and steady, telling her that she must go with them for now. Her golden eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head fiercely, saying again and again, "Dal home, Dal home." His hands trembled as he held her face gently, telling her she would always be his child, no matter where she went. The soldiers pried her away, and her cries echoed through the station. Daniel's chest felt hollow as he watched her reach for him until she disappeared into the great vessel. In that moment, a silence heavier than space itself filled him, a silence made of loss and helplessness. He stood there long after the ship had gone, unable to move, unable to believe that the small cub he had rescued so long ago was no longer at his side. Days turned into weeks, and the ship felt empty without her. Daniel wandered the halls, seeing the places where she had once played, hearing echoes of her laughter that were no longer there. The crew spoke little, giving him space, for they knew his grief ran deep. He often sat in the cockpit staring at the stars, wondering if she was safe, if she remembered him, if she still called him home. But rumors began to spread across the systems. Whispers spoke of a lost heir returned to her people, of a young leader rising among them, carrying the strength of her bloodline and the wisdom of her human guardian. Daniel did not know how much was truth and how much was myth, but he clung to the hope that she was alive and strong. One night, While docked on a lonely outpost, he overheard a group of merchants discussing a prophecy from Lyra's people. They said that in their time of greatest need, a child abandoned in exile would return to unite them, and that she would come not alone but with the spirit of another world within her. Daniel's heart tightened at those words, for he knew the prophecy was about her, and he knew that his small act of feeding a dying cub had become part of something far greater than himself. He realized then that their story was not over, though. She had been taken, though distance now lay between them, their bond was unbroken. One day, perhaps many years from now, she would return, not as the small cub he had rescued, not as the child who called him home, but as something far more powerful. The thought filled him with both pride and sorrow, for now Daniel carried on, moving from system to system, always listening for news, always searching the stars for any sign of her. Though his ship was silent and his arms empty, he knew that somewhere out there Lyra was alive, growing into her destiny. And though he could not stand beside her now, the day would come when their paths crossed again, and when that day came, the universe itself would remember the bond between a human and the abandoned cub he had saved. The return 2 decades passed, like a slow tide for Daniel, and in those long years, the weight of time pressed heavily on his shoulders. His hair had turned gray, and his hands no longer carried the steady strength they once did, yet his spirit remained unbroken. He had seen many corners of the galaxy during those years, but none of them filled the empty space inside him where memories of Lyra lived. He often found himself sitting by the viewing panel of his modest home on a frontier world, watching the stars as if waiting for her silhouette to appear among them. Life in the frontier was simple and quiet. Daniel had left his ship behind after his body grew weary of endless travel. He worked repairing broken machines for settlers, trading stories for food, and living a life that seemed small compared to the vast adventures of his past. Yet no matter how quiet the days became, he never stopped thinking about the cub he had once carried in his arms, the girl who had grown under his watchful eyes, the child who had been torn away by soldiers who claimed her as heir. Rumors still traveled through markets and taverns, whispers of a leader who had risen among distant stars, a woman of golden eyes who commanded vast fleets and carried herself with the strength of destiny. Some called her the Empress of a powerful empire, others spoke of her as a conqueror, some as a savior. Daniel never spoke her name aloud, but inside his heart he knew who she was. He never doubted it. The little one he had fed with trembling hands in a wreck of twisted metal was alive, and her light now shone across the galaxy. One evening, as Daniel tended to a broken water pump on the edge of the settlement, the ground trembled beneath his feet. He looked up to the sky and saw streaks of fire cutting across the heavens, not meteors but ships, great and countless, descending through the atmosphere. Panic filled the settlement as people ran to shelters, believing an invasion had come. Daniel stood motionless, his old heart thundering in his chest, for he recognized the symbols carved into the hulls of the ships. They were the same crest he had seen 2 decades ago when soldiers had taken Lyra away. The sky grew dark with their presence, and then a single vessel larger than any building descended in silence, landing outside the settlement. Its ramp lowered slowly, and from the blinding light within emerged a figure surrounded by guards in silver armor. The figure moved with regal grace, tall and commanding, cloaked in garments that shimmered with threads of gold and deep crimson. The guards bowed low, but the figure did not look at them, her golden eyes fixed only ahead as she stepped forward. Daniel felt his breath catch. Time seemed to fold upon itself as memory and reality collided. He saw not the Empress the galaxy feared or loved, but the small cub who had once hidden behind his arm, the child who had clung to his hand crying, "Dal home." He whispered her name, though no one around him understood. "Lyra," she stopped. At the sound, her gaze sweeping across the gathered settlers, until it found him. For a moment the regal mask slipped, and her eyes softened with recognition. She walked past the kneeling guards and stunned settlers, moving straight toward the old man who stood trembling with disbelief. When she reached him, she lowered herself to one knee, bowing her head, a gesture that shocked all who watched. The Empress of a mighty empire knelt before a weathered human mechanic. "Father," she said in a voice that carried both command and warmth, a voice that had grown but still carried the echo of the child he had known. Daniel's knees weakened, and he reached out with shaking hands to touch her face. He could barely believe the truth before his eyes, yet the golden light of her gaze left no doubt. It was her, the cub he had saved, the child he had raised, the heir he had lost. The guards shifted uneasily, unsure how to respond, but the Empress raised her hand and silence fell. She helped Daniel stand, her grip strong and steady, and together they faced the stunned settlers. "This man," she declared in a voice that rang like thunder, "is the reason I live. When all had abandoned me, when my people left me to die, he gave me food, shelter, and love. Without him there would be no Empress, no empire united under my name. His kindness is greater than all my armies." Her words spread quickly through the settlement and beyond as broadcasts captured the moment. Across the galaxy, people watched as their ruler knelt before a human, not for conquest, not for war, but for gratitude. Daniel felt his chest swell with emotions he could not name. Pride, relief, love, and sorrow mingled together until his eyes blurred with tears. That night he sat with her in the quiet of her great vessel, the noise of soldiers and engines far away. They spoke for hours, catching up on years stolen from them. She told him of the battle she had fought, the challenges of ruling, the loneliness of leadership. He told her of his small life on the frontier, of the empty silence she had left behind. She listened with the same attentiveness she had as a child, her hand resting on his as if to anchor herself to the memory of who she once was, though the weight of command lay heavy on her. In his presence she became once again the girl who had followed him through narrow ship corridors, the child who had laughed at simple stories, the cub who had once pressed her head against his arm when storms outside had shaken their vessel. He realized then that no matter how many titles she carried, no matter how many systems bent before her, to him she would always be Lyra, and to her he would always be Dal, the human who had given her life when she had none, but even as joy filled the night, Daniel could not ignore the truth. Her return meant something greater was coming. An empress did not travel with entire fleets only to embrace her past. The galaxy was changing, and he feared that their reunion, as miraculous as it was, might be only the beginning of something vast and dangerous. Still, as he looked at her golden eyes glowing in the dim light, Daniel allowed himself peace. After 20 years of waiting, the child he had lost had returned, not as the helpless cub he had rescued, but as the empress of her people. And though the future was uncertain, one truth stood unshaken: his small act of kindness had shaped the destiny of stars. The legacy morning broke across the frontier world, though the light of its sun was pale compared to the brilliance of the fleets that hung above in orbit. The villagers who once trembled in fear now walked with awe, for they had seen their empress kneel before a human no one thought mattered. They whispered Daniel's name as if it carried new weight. Children pointed toward his home with wonder, and traders spoke carefully around him, their voices filled with respect. He had not asked for this honor, but it had come, and it rested on him like a heavy cloak dot inside the great vessel. Daniel and Lyra sat together once more, the night's long conversation still alive in their minds. She told him she could not stay forever. Her empire needed her. Wars pressed at its borders, and decisions only she could make waited for her return. Yet she had come here because in her heart, the bond between them was more powerful than the crown she wore. She wanted him to know he was not forgotten and never would be. Daniel listened, his old hands resting on the table, his eyes filled with pride. He had feared for many years that she might grow and forget the human who had fed her when she was nothing but a dying cub. But her presence here swept those fears away. No matter how vast her empire, no matter how many voices sang her name, she had remembered. More than that, she had carried his lessons into the throne itself. Later that day, the Empress gathered her people, and the settlers before her. Daniel stood beside her, uncertain but unable to refuse when she called him forward. Before the crowd and the cameras that carried the moment across the galaxy, she spoke with a voice that filled the air. She told them of a time when she had been abandoned, in the ruins of war, left to starve and die. She told them of a human who had no reason to help her, yet chose compassion over fear. She told them that without him, the child would have perished, and the Empress would never have risen. Remember this, she said to her people. Power does not begin with armies or thrones. It begins with kindness. It begins with the choice to give life when all others choose to take it. This human saved me, and because of him I stand before you. His people are not weak. His people are not strangers. They are our allies, bound to us not by conquest but by compassion. Her words carried across systems, spreading through networks, reaching the ears of rulers, soldiers, and wanderers alike. For the first time, humans, who were often seen as fragile in a galaxy of stronger species, were spoken of with reverence. Not for their weapons or fleets, but for the simple humanity that had changed the fate of an empire. Daniel felt overwhelmed as the crowd bowed before him. He had never sought glory, never dreamed of such recognition. He was just a man who once could not walk away from a starving cub. Yet now he saw how that moment had grown into something larger than he could have imagined. His chest ached with emotion, and his eyes blurred with tears he did not try to hide. In the days that followed, Lyra remained close to him, refusing to let duty take her away too quickly. They walked the streets together, and everywhere they went people stared with awe. She spoke with him about her plans, about treaties she wanted to sign, about reforms she hoped to make. She told him that his teachings of fairness, of protecting the weak, of choosing mercy when others chose cruelty, had shaped her rule. She said that even in the great halls of her empire, she still heard his voice guiding her. Daniel found peace. In those days, though, he knew they were borrowed. He could see the weight on her shoulders, the endless responsibilities of leadership. At night she sat with maps and reports while her guards stood silently by, and he saw how heavy the crown truly was. He wished he could protect her as he once had, shield her from all harm, but he knew the child was long gone. Before him now stood a leader of millions, yet in the quiet moments when she rested her head against his arm, he still saw the cub he had once carried wrapped in his jacket. When the time came for her to leave, the entire settlement gathered to watch. The massive fleets prepared to depart, their engines glowing like suns. Yet the Empress delayed until the last moment, standing with Daniel in the silence before farewell. She placed her hands over his and whispered that she would return whenever she could, that no distance would erase what they shared. He smiled faintly, telling her that no matter how far she went, she would always be his child. They embraced, and though the weight of years pressed on him, he felt strength in that final moment. She stepped back, her golden eyes shining with unspoken emotion, then turned and walked up the ramp of her vessel. The doors closed and the great ship rose into the sky, joining the countless others until they vanished into the stars. Daniel stood watching long after they were gone. Around him the villagers remained silent, as if afraid to break the sacred weight of the moment. Finally, he turned and walked back to his home, his heart heavy yet full. He knew his life would not stretch much longer, but he also knew he had already lived enough for 10 lifetimes. He had seen the power of a single choice ripple through the galaxy. He had seen kindness grow into legacy. In the years that followed, stories spread of the Empress who carried the spirit of humanity within her. of the human who had fed an abandoned cub and changed the course of empires. Children repeated the tale in schools, travelers told it in taverns, rulers spoke of it in councils. Humanity was no longer remembered only as wanderers or traders or settlers. They were remembered for their heart, for the compassion of one man who had chosen to save instead of abandon. And when Daniel finally passed away beneath the same stars he had once traveled, the Empress ordered that his name be carved into the stone of her capital, not as a warrior or conqueror, but as father, protector, and friend. His resting place became a place of pilgrimage, not for humans alone, but for all who believed that mercy could shape destiny. In the end, Daniel's story was not about battles won or empires ruled, but about a single act of kindness in a moment of despair. That act had grown until it touched millions, proving that humanity's greatest strength was not in power but in humanity itself. And across the stars, wherever her fleets traveled and her voice carried, the Empress always remembered the man who had given her life when no one else would. The end.